right, thank you everybody for indulging our 5-minute break. Now we are on to items for discussion and action. Item F, we went through 1 and 2. We're on item number 3. Mr. Superintendent?
So I bring forward policy 6550, leave of absence, as a first reading to the Board of Trustees. This policy was discussed at our strategic planning committee meeting, and basically it speaks to leave of absences and the amount of time allocated by the state for people to engage in cancer screenings. Prior, the cancer screenings were very specific. It's either mammogram, and it was expanded to prostate exams, but the guidance was to just generalize it for cancer screenings in general. And that's basically the bulk of the change in the policy that we're recommending. Again, we're just aligning ourselves with the language in other NISBA policies.
And this is a first reading, so there's no
Correct.
action.
Correct.
Okay. Item number 4? Oh, well, were there any questions on the policy? Okay. Item number 4?
Item number 4 is our draft calendar that you all were afforded a copy to. Again, it's right now, we're still having meetings, discussions about specific events during the scholastic school year. But we just wanted to present the draft of the calendar as is the board, just for their review. And again, it's just up for review and discussion if there's any initial questions. We're going to have subsequent meetings to discuss dates and quarter ending dates and finalize these dates as they come along.
So we're not acting on this calendar?
Not yet. And we did have some inquiries through emails which were forwarded to you, which you are taking into consideration.
Correct. One of the inquiries was about the Passover observance, but our entire spring break occurs during Passover, so it's not a conflict. In the upcoming school year, the Easter holiday and Passover are sort of spread out over the month. So what we're proposing for the Easter weekend is to have that Friday and Monday off. For those who observe Easter, at least they'll have a reprieve the following Monday. And for those community members who observe Passover, schools will not be in session, so it kind of worked out. In the subsequent year, the following of the holidays becomes a little bit more complicated, but we're not there yet.
Any other questions of the consolidated calendar? Okay. Why don't we go through the capital reserve vote and the
Sure.
new reserve, and we'll save your budget presentation for the end.
Sounds good. So, the Board of Trustees has sort of discussed quite a bit the need to engage in capital improvement projects, and one of the mechanisms school districts have to engage in capital improvements is a capital reserve, which is analogous to having a savings account, even though Mr. Gee gets angry because it's an actual account, it's a reserve. But they're monies that are allocated for specific purposes. In this case, the capital reserve is allocated for capital improvement projects. We have money, the reserve is fully funded, we have monies left over. So what we're recommending is another capital reserve vote to use those funds to address the need to replace the windows at Vernon W. Pritz Elementary School, which has been a topic of discussion in this community even before I started as superintendent. It's something I gleaned from watching prior board meetings. So I don't know if there's any discussion or questions.
Are you-
I just need a clarification. We have a capital reserve fund right now
Correct.
that has about $2.5 million left in it. And the proposition would be to, if approved by the taxpayers, to expend that money on Verdcrit's windows. Is that right?
Correct.
And so that's item F6.
Correct.
And then F7
I was
is
gonna discuss next.
is setting up a new reserve fund? Yes. Okay.
So
Thank you.
basically,
Thanks for the explanation.
yeah, I was going to go into the next discussion item as indicated in the agenda. So the public has to vote on how we use capital reserve funds. So we need public approval to use it, and we have to be very specific in its use. So the public votes to have we'll use it for Twitch windows replaced, and that's the project we're going to engage in, and that's how we'll use those funds. Because we've used our capital reserve once already, when we upgraded our security systems, or in the process of doing that, and our turf field, these are the monies left over from the fund that was, or the capital reserve that was funded previously. Now it's time to approve another capital reserve fund and start funding that over the next 10 years. We're proposing to have a capital reserve fund of $15 million that we funded during the course of 10 years. So at the end of 10 years, the hopes is to have amassed $15 million to continually engage in capital improvement projects, which again yields revenue in the form of state aid in the long term. But also more important than that, allows us to engage in much needed capital improvements to our facilities.
And so both of these are, I'm sorry. You okay?
Yeah, I had a question, I didn't mean to
Oh,
interrupt.
no, that's okay. I'll ask my question and then you're free to ask yours. So both of these actions, the capital reserve vote and the new reserve vote, require action tonight? Because it.
It would require action at our next board meeting. So
Okay.
first, procedurally,
So no
we have to
action
discuss
tonight.
it and propose it to you
Okay,
as a team, and then we vote on it. So there are two votes and two propositions, and what the Board of Trustees does is to vote whether or not we want this to be a proposition on our ballot in May. So there would be three total propositions. One is the recommended budget. The second would be approving the use of the capital reserve for the specific purpose. And the third was to start a new capital reserve that would be funded over 10 years.
okay.
But my question is, if we approve this and the taxpayers authorize it,
Correct.
and we start to fund the $15 million new reserve fund, you don't have to completely fund it before spending from it, do you, if the taxpayers
No, you
want
could,
us to use it?
like, you could fund it with $1 million, and then you could go and say, okay, now I wanna spend the $1 million. So
Okay.
it doesn't, you don't have to wait until you get 15.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the vote? Yes.
Yeah. What's the cap on how much money we can put in capital reserve? Is there a cap on how much money you can put in it? There isn't. Oh,
I
okay.
thought that there was.
I thought there was too. I thought it was 10 million. That's what I thought it was. That's, we're sure about that.
That was what the old one was.
The old one was 10 million. I thought it was 10 million because that was the max, but it doesn't mean I'm right. I'm just
No,
saying that's
it's
my
what they
perception.
It's what they established, so it was 10 million because that's what you agreed to.
Okay, so you have to
Now-
establish what your max
Yes,
will
you
be
establish it.
when you establish. Okay, that makes more sense.
In my previous district, we had one for 20, then we had one for 25. It was
Got
what the board
Okay,
established.
so I guess my question is, why would we be starting a capital fund for work that we think we'll need in 10 years? Like I get planning for the future, we certainly will need,
Over
but,
10 years.
excuse me?
Over 10
Yeah,
years.
in 10 years. No,
During the course of
During
10
the
years.
course of 10 years.
okay, all right, so that changes, because that, you said it differently, you said so that we can reserve, say, 15 million for, okay, so I
It would be
misunderstood.
funded during the course of 10.
I
so in
get
other
it,
words-
that's what I thought, that's why I thought it was odd, that you were saying just establish a saving, and in 10 years we get the 15 million, we'll spend
No,
No,
it.
but to
no.
But
to
why
your
would
point,
we-
I think we're only able to establish the reserve fund for 10 years, and then we have to renew.
Correct.
No, that was
Establish
the
it.
old one,
no.
unless there's a
Hold on.
statute.
They're all 10 years, it's how much,
Okay.
right?
The old one was 10 million, I believe, over 7 years? I'm
Nope.
not sure, I'd have to look.
It's 10
This-
years, it's 10 over 10,
Okay, this one we're asking for 15 over 10.
okay. So you're saying that this is to build up funds so that we can spend it along the way? Correct, okay. So then the next question is, my question is a little bit different, but kind of the same. Why would we be initiating this? Well, hold on, let me ask another question first, and I apologize. If we establish it at 15 million, do we have to fully fund it, or we could say, never mind, we only want to go to 7 million?
Not to exceed 15 million.
But, yeah, okay, so it's not to exceed, it's not, it has to be 15 million. But I guess I'd like to know why we would consider setting up a capital reserve now when we know full well in the next few years, we're gonna need to float a real bond and do real work. It's gonna be inevitable. So, and the only reason why I would be hesitant to this is because there will be fatigue from voters over bonds, because this stuff, as you can see, this room was full 20 minutes ago, it's empty now during the budget talks, right? So people aren't gonna pay attention, we know that. This is hard to understand to begin with. So if we go out and we say, all right, we just did a capital reserve vote for the field, now we're gonna do another one for the windows, that could create some questions. And what we've recently went through over the bonds, people are suspicious. Just because we're not feeling it now doesn't mean it's still not there, right? So why would we, again, establish something now when, in my eyes, in the next 3 to 5 years, we need to take a significant bond? So why wouldn't we just focus on planning for that and then establish something after the fact? Because if we don't get a bond done in the next couple of years, we're gonna be in trouble for repairs, and we're not gonna be able to save it through budget lines and capital reserves.
So I think both are true. I think I think I'd be concerned with not having capital reserve funds at all, because there's certain unforeseeable things that can happen. And also, it's a risky proposition to propose a bond, obviously, when we look at the building condition survey, it indicated over $80 million worth of work that the district needs. But I think we have to do things in like incremental steps. One of those steps that we're proposing is that interfund transfer line, because that allows ongoing capital improvements that are needed on a smaller scale. The other side of it is we engage in these capital improvements so that we generate state aid as well, to try to mitigate that differential that we have with the state aid and the previous bonds. So we're doing our best, not just to enhance our facilities, because as a taxpayer, certainly in my community, I love to see my taxpayer dollars at work, and I want the schools in my community to look contemporary and be safe. But I think we're in a position where there's almost no point in having the money sitting in the reserve. We should, crits, that discussion's been happening for a couple of years now. I do think the windows need to be updated. And I think it's in our interest to start a reserve. And the pace at which we sort of fund it is all going to be contingent upon the current fiscal situation of the school district. So again, when we say not to exceed $15 million, hopefully we'll be in a great place 10 years from now, and perhaps we'll pass a bond by then. I think my vision for bonds is to do them incrementally, not to do a massive bond, like a $100 million or $90 million bond.
No,
But rather to do like smaller bonds to address really urgent area, and then, obviously you make the improvements to the buildings, but you're gonna have that continual flow of state aid.
I guess the overarching point I'm trying to make is that if you're, in my eyes, right, you're right, not a huge bond, but I could see a bond that probably goes up to somewhere around 30 million as an appropriate number over the course of some point of the next 3 years. It really needs, 3 to 5, but my real thinking is it's 3 years we need to really be working on a bond, and I feel like we need to be discussing what that looks like now, and I think this would be, and I get your point of having it, but this would be wasteful now, because why would you, if you're gonna fund 15 million over 10 years, how much are you really gonna have in that account over the next 2 years, when we should have our sleeves rolled up and be planning a significant bond to do significant work? It just seems like we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit, that's all. I really am mindful of perception from the community over bonds right now.
I just want to say, bond is borrowing, and so that there's a, cost involved in that. When we use the capital reserve, it's our own money, so there's a savings.
No, I get all that. I'm just saying you're not gonna generate enough money in the immediate few years to do any type of significant work, and we're gonna need significant work done in the next few years. So it just seems like it's really not worth it to engage at this point.
But along the same lines, we have to look at interest rates, and right now, interest rates are not working in our favor. Really our priority is, this year, was to really look at the long-term planning, to your point, and to really propose a budget that's gonna be efficient and that's gonna support our programs without burdening our community. So that really was our first priority. I think once we get past that hurdle and we really have an understanding of our budget, we do have to talk about bonds in the future. It's inevitable. The buildings, we haven't had a bond, better than I do, 15 years,
We all
20
know,
years?
everybody in the town knows when we had the last bond, believe
It's been
me.
a long time, and that's what school districts do. Otherwise, anybody who owns a home knows you have to do improvements to your house. Eventually, things start falling apart. But I do think both can be true. I think you can entertain the idea of having a reserve and the idea of start really and start thinking about a bond. Trustee Trent.
So I have two questions. The first one is, with the trend of how things are going now, the next 2 years or 3 years, how much money do you ideally would like to put into this bond that you are suggesting we create?
So no disrespect, I'm not gonna answer that question. I can't predict it. And I don't wanna commit to a number. It's impossible to tell. It's hard to tell what priorities are year to year. So obviously you wanna fund it appropriately, and, but, I think it would be disingenuous of me to give a number at this point.
Okay, so my second question is the reserve that we have now, the capital reserve we have now, what was that filled to?
What was the question?
The capital reserve we have now, the cap it's 10 years, it's 10 million over 10 years.
Yeah, so it's fully funded.
It has been fully
It's
funded
fully funded.
to the $10 million cap.
We can't put any more into it.
But it's already been used, it's not that we have.
No,
to
no,
put things
I
left.
know, but
Yeah.
the point of my question was, can we put that money that we would have generated or moved into this new capital reserve, into the old one, instead of making
You
a
can't.
new?
So if we
Okay.
don't, if we don't do this, we have no more capital reserve.
Okay.
Should we choose to use what's left?
Right.
Question on this side.
Oh, sorry.
So,
Go right
Nice to
ahead.
be acknowledged every once in a while.
Go right ahead. You're acknowledged all the time.
Wow. I had my hand up the entire time everybody else has been asked questions. From that standpoint, the question that I wanted to ask was in regard to how the $15 million total came up with. Is that based on the budget, or is it based on the needs, or is it based on, where did that number come from?
Both, what you're saying, needs and budget.
Okay, where did it come from? I mean, obviously, we talk about a building condition survey that is far extensive from that. You're talking about an amount that was explained to us as something that does not need to be filled entirely, so that if you get to the stage where it's not financial. I'm just curious as to why the number became 15 million.
It's a number that is something that we could work for over the 10 years. It's reasonable.
And it's also,
Reasonable based on,
On the amount of monies that we want to be putting in year over year.
so, yeah, and again, we could have limited it to $10 million, we think $15 million is more appropriate. Other districts have bigger capital reserve funds,
right,
but we have
does
to
seem
keep.
very limited.
Hmm?
Does seem very limited as opposed to our district needs.
So, and I'm glad you said that, because to trustee Pacini's point, if it's gonna go beyond $15 million, that's when we start contemplating bonds. And if the market changes and interest rates change, yeah, that's another avenue you pursue.
But if they continue in the direction they're going,
Right.
this is going to be the way that you're going to address it, and we will have potentially limited ourselves.
It's a good point, and like I said, like, where the number came up with is a great question, and obviously, there's a number we want to fund this with each year, but, you know, I don't know, do we have a number that we're gonna set, or that's gonna be determined every year, or are we gonna preset it, you know, do you have an idea of what you wanna, how much money in the budget you wanna use to fund this reserve?
It would be discussed each year as we develop the reserve plan. So like when we get towards the end of a fiscal year, we would determine at that point how much fund balance we had and how much money we would want to put aside to the capital reserve.
So when you do this, you're saying this money's gonna come from unused fund balance versus, you know, a budget line, right? I still stand by my comments earlier. I think, and I understand where you're both coming from, I really do. This is prudent, it sure is, but I don't know that this community is really ready for it. I don't know that the trust is completely there. I'd really like to see what happens when we get to election time. And, you know, with all due respect, you haven't been here very long, so you don't have that history. And that's what my concern is, because, you know, as soon as you say the word bond and there's a vote, there's gonna be discussions, and there's gonna, you know, we had attempts to vote down our budget last year and things like that. And I don't think it'll be successful to vote down the budget, but I would just like to make sure we're, you know, walking before we can run, while being prudent of the timeline of getting things done, so that we have time to have real meaningful conversation with stakeholders as to what this looks like before we start asking them for votes. Because if we put up a vote and then ask, and then try to explain it to them, I think that's unfair.
My next question is about the 10 years. So if we put up a 15 or whatever the dollar amount is, and it's for 10 years, and it doesn't become fully funded in that time, or if we fully fund it early, are we limited in terms of that 10-year time frame of putting up another piece?
I'll ask the attorney, but I'm pretty sure you can do another one, like if it's fully funded, like let's say we fully funded in 5, then could we do another one?
I'll have to report back to you on that.
Okay.
I don't,
Because that's my fear is if it's hard without all the information in terms of, I see I've now fully immersed myself in reading the building condition survey, looking at where the economy is currently going right now. This could be an important thing. I just don't want to limit either the amount or our ability to go back and revisit this discussion if I see the buildings. I know the issue that, you know, I don't wanna pick a vote without more information on that, just in case we run down to, we don't have enough, funding in it, and now we can't go back that route. And then we're forced into a bond during a bad, potentially economic time.
And just to be clear, there's no vote being taken tonight. This is for discussion.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm asking the question now, to make sure that
Okay,
we have all the information before we actually do it.
understood.
No, and I appreciate your concerns. You know, to me, it's, yeah, I think, you know, part of, like I said, in one of my first budget presentations is the objective is to earn, you know, the confidence of the board and the trust of the community during our budget process. And so, we're sort of, and I wouldn't say that we're running before we're walking, but certainly we want to continually to generate that building aid, and our buildings, just based on that survey, need work. So we're trying to find different ways to mitigate that, and every little sort of thing that we can do to chip away at it helps. So, you know, again, the interfund transfer line is one. We passed a capital reserve vote in October, and we have money sitting in a reserve now. Do we use it now so that we could hopefully get this process started? 'Cause you gotta remember that, you know, once a capital reserve vote is passed, there's still time. You still have to make proposals, you have to submit proposals to the state. We're looking at like, typically like a year timeline. So there's that component that we're thinking about as well.
I think it's a very prudent idea, and I like it because it is not the bond that we would be concerned about, or the use of, you know, the concern about the public reaction to the old bond and the problems that generated. We're not talking about bonding now. We're just talking about basically setting up a savings account and funding it as best we're able over the next 10 years in order to have a savings account to do some of the bigger work that needs to be done, chipping away at that property condition survey. So I think it's a prudent thing to do. And I don't think it ties our hands.
And just to follow up on Vice President Hayes, the fact that it's our own money and not costing us interest is important. And we've succeeded over the last several years with our capital reserve. And with respect to the budget, everyone around this horseshoe is all cognizant of the issues that happened last year and the concerns of the residents, which is why we had the superintendent go to community meetings already before the budget roadshow. And he was announced that he was going to be talking about his approach to the budget. And those meetings were attended by probably 15, no more than 20 people. No arguments, no hostility. He was met with great reviews as someone who is willing to be out in the forefront ahead of time, ahead of the budget, and I feel that in itself is building confidence with our.
I appreciate those comments, and it really is a complex situation. You know, not only is school accounting complex to begin with, I think there's a lack of understanding in terms of the general population. Certainly me as a building principal, when I sat for budget presentations, I didn't fully understand them. Certainly understand numbers, I understand the idea that, you know, you want to minimize expenditures, and but, you know, there's certain nuances and things that you need to appreciate. And even though I wasn't physically here, I certainly watched the board meeting, so I'm aware of what happened. So that's what we kind of changed the approach to our budget presentations. We wanted to present them more like lessons so people understand what we're talking about. And again, increase just the transparency and the information we're providing the community. So we're sort of leading in that direction. So, you know, we're pretty much halfway through the budget process, which I'll discuss in a minute. But I love the fact that we can have all these sort of opposing points of view. I think that's what makes a good team, because we want the counter argument to the argument, and it certainly informs our decisions as an administrative team. And no, we appreciate all the comments, and it's you know, I think building consensus and building an approach to mitigate some of the challenges we face needs diversity of thought. And we've been talking about equity and diversity a lot, but we didn't talk about the fact that diversity of thought is really important, and I appreciate it.
So with that, if there's no further questions of the capital reserve or the reserve the new reserve vote, we will move on to the budget presentation.
Wait,
One more
are we
question?
gonna do, capture GH and I and get that out of the way and then do the
What's the
presentation?
pleasure of the board? You want to just vote on those now? Because we do have to
On
know-
what?
We'll, on
G-
G, H, and I
GH&I.
before the superintendent does the budget presentation?
Yeah, G, H, and I.
Okay? So all the items, we'll go through this, once, we'll review it once before we take the vote. So we're going to be voting on the items in G, 1, 2, and 3. H, everything in the personnel agenda, and I, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3. And we're gonna take that all in one motion. Okay, everybody understand that? Okay.
Yeah, just 1 and 2 in G.
Just 1 and 2 and G,
Correct.
yeah, because the other one does
Yep.
say consent, so.
Catch
Right,
up.
it's- Yeah,
I got it.
okay.
Are you ready for my
All right,
recommendation?
so ready for your recommendation.
So listen closely, Board of Trustees. The administration recommends approval of curriculum items D1 through G2, in addition to the approval of business items I1 through I3, in addition to items H1 through H9. I'm going to repeat that, and I apologize. The administration recommends approval of curriculum items G1 through G2, personnel items H1 through H9, and business items I1 through I3.
All right, I'm sorry, I have to stop you. G3 is an item unto itself, or is that everything above?
No, everything above.
That's consent.
Yeah.
That's consent, okay,
So there's
thank
only
you,
two.
okay, go ahead.
Should I repeat it?
Yes, please.
All right. The administration recommends approval of curriculum items in schedules G1 through G2, personnel changes reflected in schedules H1 through H9, and business items reflected in schedules I1 through I3.
Okay, got it. So we need G, 1 and 2, H, 1 through 9, I, 1, 2, and 3. We need a motion and a second. Motion by trustee Barry, seconded by Vice President Hayes. Is there any further discussion? Seeing no further, is that
I just
discussion?
wanted to say that at a future meeting, I'd like to be able to publicly talk about the Education Foundation.
I have a comment, and
All
we're
right.
going to follow up on that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so hearing no further questions, all those in favor of the items as spoken, please raise your hands. Seeing all hands raised, the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Board of Trustees. And to Vice President Hayes' point, I am going to speak more in depth about the grants which have been afforded to us by the South Country Educational Foundation. We have a fantastic partnership with that organization. They've been more than generous to our school district, and they certainly deserve the recognition. So tonight was a matter of approving the grants that they're providing. And at our next meeting, due to the length of the meeting today, I actually spoke to them and said, don't be offended if we don't have anything a little bit more ceremonious, but we're certainly going to call them back at our second meeting in March, because we do appreciate their support.
All right, you're up with the budget presentation.
And talk about pressure. All right.
Just a reminder to the board, we do have to go into executive session after this, after the meeting.
It's gonna be a long night.
It is gonna be a long night.
Position?
Yeah, let me just check. Yeah, that's good.
All right. So some people in the community are watching The Mandalorian tonight on Wednesday, the second episode. We're going to be watching a budget presentation, which will be just as compelling. All right. Thank you, Ms. All right, so it's my pleasure to present our fourth budget presentation. And again, I want to thank Ms. Gee, our business official, for doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. One of the things we like to emphasize is our collaboration. So as part of my learning process as a first-year superintendent, I love presenting these budget presentations because it gives me the opportunity to really hone in my skills and my familiarity with budgeting. And I want to do it in a manner that's accessible to our community members and our trustees so you fully understand what it is that we're talking about. So today we're going to be talking about expenditures, which are our expenses, and specifically the 2000 code, which covers curriculum and instruction. Before we begin, I love emphasizing the fact that the budget process is an ongoing process that takes several months. Right now, we're going to be discussing curriculum and instruction. And as we start finalizing numbers and still making calculations and making analysis, these things are revisited on April 5th when we give an update as to where we are in terms of expenses and revenue. So a lot of these numbers will get modified throughout the process. This is sort of a synopsis of where we're at right now and what we're looking at moving forward. And again, I want to remind the community and the board that on May 3rd, we'll have a budget hearing, which will be followed by our election on May 16th. So please come out and vote in your community. We've discussed this at length. Right now, we're discussing staffing. More specifically, our next presentation is going to be specifically on staffing based on FTEs, which are full-time equivalent employees. So we've begun that process. So when we look at some of the proposals for salaries embedded in this presentation, they're preliminary, and then we're going to really get down and really look at our programs, our enrollment, course requests to really make a final determination of what our staffing needs will be for the upcoming school year. Again, part of our process is making a lot of considerations, our board priorities, and again, I said this earlier in the meeting, is really gaining the confidence of the Board of Trustees and the trust of our community in our budget process. We use several resources in making our determinations and making decisions, from consultants to other peers in our positions. And again, we get engaged in a budget process that doesn't simply roll over budgets, but we look at our needs and try to differentiate between wants and needs. In terms of our long-term planning, Trustee Puccini kind of spoke about some of the apprehension in our community about our long-term outlook. You know, we have three real challenges. The first two are challenges that are universal to all school districts in New York State, which is again, inflation and how the tax cap is calculated, the federal grants period end date, which end the following year, next year, and the differential in our state aid and our building aid and our bond payments. So what we're looking to do to mitigate those concerns is, again, ongoing review of programs to reduce expenditures. We spoke about this a little bit before, but engage in capital improvement projects, first and foremost because we need it, second because it also generates revenue in the form of building aid, and we've already had a capital reserve vote approved by our public for $2.6 million. We're looking to engage in an energy performance contract, which is budget neutral, which will enable us to do about $5.6 million, and this is just an estimate, very preliminary. We recommended a capital transfer line of $1 million, which doesn't seem that monumental in terms of school expenses, but it allows you to chip away at some of these things that you can do in the immediate future, and to Trustee Puccini's point, future bond proposals. We're also looking to look towards donations and grants. Once a school budget is approved, one of the ways you generate fund balance is by getting grants or getting people to pay for certain expenditures that you budgeted for. So then that allows you to have extra money at the end of the scholastic year. And this also involves the strategic use of reserves to the extent possible. The use of reserves is dictated by law, not so much by choice. And so you want to build healthy reserves so that you can use them, but the idea, and I use a roller coaster image, is that your reserves go up and down through the course of the history of the school district. None of this is new, so I'm going through it quick. We talked about the tax cap calculation. It's based on an 8-step formula. The maximum tax levy that we can ask for with simple majority vote is 4.64%. We also reported this to news as our intended tax levy increase, because what school districts do is you just use your max as the intended, not because you intend to ask for a 4.64 tax levy increase, but that's our number. We know we're not going to ask, or we shouldn't ask for more than that, so typically school districts will just include that number as their intended. But that's not our tax levy, or nor would it be our proposal. We'll know that in April when we propose the final budget. The reason it's 4.64% primarily is because we added this intra-fund transfer line, and just for the sake of transparency, without the $1 million intra-fund transfer line, our tax cap limit would have been 3.12%, if I recall. We found it important to embed that transfer line. Many school districts do it. Some school districts, in fact, have a transfer line that's more than $1 million. We thought that was sufficient for the short term and something that will be doable for us. And again, I want to emphasize that the tax levy limit is not a sort of a benchmark from which we work backwards in budgeting. We're going to put together a budget based on the needs of the district. And when we get into that, you know, the hope is that it's below your tax levy limit, but more importantly, that we don't overburden our taxpayers. In terms of revenue, we talked about different revenue sources. The tax levy represents almost 50% of our revenue, state aid about 40%, other revenue, which includes pilots and such, and appropriate fund balances. About 5% of our revenue came from fund balances from the prior year. So when we talk about percentage increases that we propose to the public, it's based on the revenue, that component of our budget, not the entire budget, but the portion of revenue that we receive as the tax levy. Initially, this right now as it stands, it looks like we're going to be getting an increase in state aid, but those numbers will be finalized once legislators work on the governor's budget. We then talked about our expenditures in the 1,000, 5,000, and 9,000 codes. We kind of talked about school district accounting. That's a generally accepted accounting principles. The GAAP is what we use. All of our revenue comes from the general fund, primarily. That's where our money is kept. And the budget codes basically indicate the revenue source, which is the letter, the function, which is the 4 digits, the object, and the function, and the location. So it's just used as a mechanism where accountants, like Ms. Segee, can immediately recognize what that budget line is just by looking at the numbers. I'm not there yet. I still have to read the text associated with it, but I do know that the 1,000 code represents administration, 2,000 is instruction, et cetera, et cetera. But we have it there. The 1,000 code is really called general support, a lot of our district offices and those expenditures. The 5,000 code is transportation, A to Z. And 9,000 code, which is called unallocated, it's a little more complex, but it's basically, it's almost like employee expenses, but are on a different line, which includes entitlements, benefits, debt, and governmental obligations. So we've spoken about this. We demonstrated our current budget and what those costs or expenditures for each of those budget lines were, compared to what we're proposing for the upcoming school year that shows an increase. And again, I want to emphasize that these numbers are preliminary and they may be changed depending on our continued analysis of the budget and the budget process. Increases tend to reflect inflation and rising costs of fuel, supplies, entitlements, and benefits that are out of our control. And also the addition of the interfund transfer line in the 9,000 code, that's the $1 million line that I spoke about, increased that line by $1 million. But we're still looking to be as efficient as possible. So today we're going to talk about the 2000 code, which covers curriculum and instruction. So the essential questions for this lesson is, what do we mean by curriculum and instruction? How does South Country Central School District organize the 2000 code for budgetary purposes, meaning how do we categorize these expenditures? And finally, what expenditures are included in the 2000 code, curriculum instruction, and what is the projected budget for these instructional expenditures? And that's what I'm going to get into right now. First, what do we mean by curriculum and instruction? Well, curriculum is what's being taught in schools. Instruction is how the curriculum is being delivered. I found this to be the most simplest way of presenting it. So the curriculum is the content, the instruction is the delivery. And when we talk about curriculum and instruction, we're talking about many things, not just academics. So those things are kind of reflected on how curriculum and instruction is sort of categorized for budget purposes. For example, all general education classrooms, district-wide, special programs, student support outside of special education, and all of the contracts, materials, and supplies associated with providing general instruction are included in these codes. This also includes mental health support outside of special education, includes athletics, intercurriculars, because again, you have to think about learning as a holistic sort of process. We learn about ourselves, our health. So basically, in general, we talk about everything that happens in our school buildings are covered under curriculum and instruction. It's also categorized as special education, which gets special funding. But I want to emphasize about these budget lines that a lot of it is regulated by law and is driven by CSCs, which are Committee Special Education, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But special education programs have their own budget lines because there's a state, local, state, and federal mandates that guide that. And finally, we also include all of our extracurricular activities, district-wide, including interscholastic athletics, those are our varsity teams and the middle school teams, intramurals, and all of the various clubs that we host here in South Country. So basically, this is the biggest sort of part of our budget, the most impactful part of our budget, and I would argue the most important part of our budget in terms of the learning that we provide. And finally, right now, I'm going to talk about specifically what are the expenditures associated in this code. We're going to begin with school district salaries and compensation. So basically, curriculum and instruction is driven by our district office, by our administrators, by our teachers. But this category of budget lines basically covers like the leadership and the support for that leadership to drive our instructional programs, which includes our assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, our directors and chairs and administrators, building administrators, because as much as building administrators are also managers of their buildings and they manage staff, they're also instructional leaders. So everything is kind of covered in this code. You see, we're proposing somewhat of a flat sort of budget for the upcoming school year. And again, the slides are numbered. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end, and if we refer back to the slides. Next is contracts, materials, and supplies. That includes a lot of different sort of categories, but supplies that our directors or our instructional leaders use to operate. One of the big cuts that you may notice there is in terms of textbooks. We dropped that by $100,000, and that's basically a result of the shift that we're doing toward digital platforms. One of the things I took for granted before I worked for schools were just how expensive textbooks were. And sometimes to get a series of textbooks for an entire grade is incredibly expensive. So we've been shifting to digital formats where the initial cost may be somewhat high, but the cost of updating it becomes a lot less. So we'll be spending less money along those lines. Next, we have building level instructional salaries, which includes our salaries for our teachers, elementary school teachers, middle school teachers. Just a point of emphasis, our 6th grade teachers are still considered elementary school teachers by certification, even though they work in the middle school. Class coverages and all these types of things. Again, we're looking at a decrease, but the decrease in salaries does not represent staffing cuts, and projections will change, again, upon careful analysis of our staffing. So again, when we look at budget lines and we make budgetary corrections, it doesn't always signify a decrease in staffing. We're going to discuss staffing specifically in our next presentation.
Mr. Santana, do you want us to hold that question to the end? Or?
Yes. We'll go back.
Can you just,
Slide 14.
you're good.
We also, important part of our instructional program are our teaching assistants, our aides, monitors. They play an important role, and this captures their salaries. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. And again, any perceived decreases are just budgetary adjustments. Right now, we're not looking at staff cuts. But when you look at budgets and what the needs are, especially for our special education students, we have diminishing needs in the upcoming year, so that's what's reflected here. And the teacher aides that you see in the standalone line for the $29,000 figure, those are teacher aides that are not special ed related. So we decided for point of clarity to separate their salaries or their costs separately. Next, we have additional instructional expenditures, which is all of the extra stuff that we do in terms of providing instruction, robotics, enrichment. And basically, one of the biggest increases that we're showing along these lines is the equipment purchase. If you see it goes up from a $26,000 figure to a $100,000 figure. Kramer is in need of an updated and more accessible playground, so we're considering engaging and purchasing that playground for Kramer right now. And again, we asked our building administrators to ask for things they thought was necessary, and there are a couple libraries that need some updating, and that's where that equipment increase is reflected. Next, we have our art department expenditures, and I had some samples of our art. There's also a substantial increase in our supplies there. If you look at the art equipment, it's a big jump for $28,000, which was budgeted in the current year, to $89,000. That's because we are looking to install a Mac lab at the high school, because right now art's moving to a digital platform and we need the right machinery to sort of carry out those projects. So that would be like a one-year sort of investment in this technology that's sorely needed at the high school, so we're considering it now. So we left it in for now, and then obviously, as we go through the budget process, we'll take a closer look to see if we can make that happen. Next is our music department expenditure, which, again, music is extremely important to us, and there's another huge increase in the music equipment line. And this is because there are musical instruments that are actually damaged by the weather and dampness that need to be replaced. They're beyond repair. We're also looking to expand our music program. There is a little bit of a pipe dream, and I don't know if it's a pipe dream, but really building our band program to include a drum line and a marching band, because that would give so many more students access to our wonderful athletics program, and really does enhance the experience when we attend football games stuff. We have a true, and our pep band, there's no criticism of our pep band, they're awesome. It's kind of volunteer based, so we want to look to expand that. But we also have to replace equipment that are very costly, and that's what that increase is represented there. Next, driver education really needs no explanation. It's a huge resource. My son went through it. I supervised driver education for 7 years in my former district. But again, it's a resource for families because one, it enables high school students to drive or have a full license at 17, which allows them to go to work and to school. It reduces insurance rates for families and obviously increases safety and awareness. So we want to maintain our driver education program. District-wide special education salaries, again, are segregated because some of these funds or rather some of these responsibilities are based on federal mandates. So those are kept separately. Special education programs are driven by individualized education plans, which we know as IEPs, and federal and state mandates. And above and beyond that, we are making a concerted effort to be able to provide special education services in district to the largest extent possible. The reason you do this is because we want to service all members of our community, including students who have special needs, students with disabilities. It's always in the best interest to have these students attend schools in our buildings, because not only does it expose them to the other kids in the community, it exposes the kids to them as well. And it really eliminates a lot of apprehension that sometimes people feel being around kids who have special needs. Along those lines, when you look at this, one of the things that we're doing is using outside services to a lesser extent. And that's when you look at contractual services there's a drop of almost $500,000 because we're actually able to support students in district to a greater extent. And the little caption I have on the side reads, well, the goal is to always offer a least restrictive environment for students. Some students require therapeutic settings based on their individualized needs as determined by a committee of special education. So sometimes these kids are better sort of serviced or educated in placements outside of the district, such as BOCES placements or therapeutic placements. And those are always really difficult decisions to make, but we always want to do what's best for the child. So right now, we're relying on outside placements to a lesser extent. And again, the ultimate goal is to really house all of our students to the greatest extent possible. Moving on to occupational technology, this again doesn't represent a drop in salaries or positions, but I will sort of provide this foreshadowing that this is going to become a bigger focus in moving along. You know, we're going to be revisiting these budget lines, I'm sure, in the future because we really do need to provide more courses that are just more occupational in terms of their purpose. And I heard, this was at the NYSSBA dinner that I attended with Trustee Felice, President Felice, and Trustee Piccini, with Bob Vecchio, who's the president of NYSSBA for is it Long Island or Suffolk County?
Nassau Suffolk School Board.
Both, Nassau and Suffolk. You know, he said one of the things school districts really should be focusing on is the 3 E's, so that all of our graduates are either enrolled, meaning enrolled in a college, employed, or enlisted. And really, all 3 tracks are really beneficial tracks. So I do think that schools are going to be shifting to a lot more CTE, which is career technical education, to give kids just practical skills. You know, with no child left behind, you know, I think the idea that everybody goes to college, but we're quickly learning that college is not for everybody, and there's no shame in that. So there's a lot of different alternate career paths. I think Mr. Khalik Allah, who came and spoke to our kids, spoke about an unorthodox pathway to success. There's a trades, and of course there's military service, which is honorable as well. So I think we're going to be seeing a shift in that in the future. Moving on, we have our summer school programs. That includes both credit recovery. So traditional summer school that we think of is credit recovery in actuality. But we also offer enrichment programs for elementary schools throughout the summer. So we want to maintain those programs to the greatest extent possible. And again, some of the adjustments you see that is just budgetary adjustments. It does not represent a drop in staff. We have library, media, computer-assisted instruction expenditures. So where we have, on one side, we have textbooks, we have technology as well. And one of the things that we increased was the ability for us to replace Chromebooks. Right now, the district has to do a better job in providing students with replacement Chromebooks, because the Chromebooks are basically essential for success at home. And if you don't have those resources at home, you're sort of, when we talk about equity and the ability to be successful, we want to make sure students have the tools necessary to do that. So
What budget line would that come from?
that is right here, Chromebook replacement program, which is 2630 to 21. So we increased it by $100,000. And next, we have guidance and health service salaries. And so basically, we say it over and over again, but health and safety are paramount, both in terms of our physical and mental health. So guidance counselors, certainly we'll see social workers in the next slide, and our school nurses certainly provide that guidance. In addition, planning for post-public school life is also paramount. So that's why we emphasize, or we really celebrate our guidance departments and our nurses for what they do in keeping our kids both physically and emotionally safe. Next, which is not necessarily a special ed function, is our mental health salaries and expenditures. Again, the decrease represents retirements and budgetary adjustments. It does not represent the cuts in our staff. If anything, we're looking to add an additional social worker to our district. And mental health in terms of services and education. And when I say education, students need to be educated about mental health. It's become a very prominent thematic element in schools. Certainly the pandemic changed that for us and focused our attention on mental health, whereas years ago, it wasn't such an emphasis. So we're lobbying on a state or legislative level to gain more support in these endeavors. And we certainly will keep the Board of Trustees posted. We have co-curricular salaries and expenditures as another group of budget lines. And again, the photos say it all. Our extracurricular activities provide students with that niche, that sense of belonging based on their interests. So when you look at our cast from the Addams Family, and you look at a diverse group of kids that are sort of united and feel a sense of belonging by participating in these activities. And we have our robotics club there. We have our restorative athletes there. So it's pretty fantastic stuff. So we want to make sure we continue supporting that. We also have physical education and athletic salaries and expenditures. Obviously, we talk about athletics a lot. We've been singing their praises. One of the biggest increases in this is in the equipment line. Let's see if my eyes find it. Oh, there it is. Equipment, we were seeing like almost a $50,000 increase. In reality, our football scoreboard is 35 years old. We're afraid that if it stops functioning, we know we can't repair it. So we're looking to maybe replace the scoreboard so that it's functional. We also need better sound systems in our gymnasiums for athletic events like basketball games. We've been relying on like speakers during great. So that's why you see a little increase in our equipment there. And the uniforms, we decided to segregate for more transparency. Uniforms used to be included in the equipment line. So we just segregated that line so we can see how much we spend on uniforms. And one of the things we're looking to do long-term is really to brand the district so that there's more uniformity in our uniforms. And there was a pun intended on purpose. And that's something we want to do over the long term. So our teams pretty much look like South Country teams. If you look at our jerseys and stuff, there's a lot of variety. So again, they're not going to look identical, but certainly the colors should be somewhat similar so that we kind of brand ourselves moving forward. And then again, that's basically all the budget lines. Again, just to recap, curriculum instruction is everything we do in our schools, pretty much sums it up. And all the staff, supplies, and outside services associated with that. We talk about general education programs, we talk about special education programs, and all of our extracurricular activities, including sports, intramurals, and clubs. So it's a pretty big sort of part of our budget. And finally, in terms of reviewing our expenditures, I included the 1,000 codes, 2,000 codes, and 9,000 codes that I showed you previously. And now we've added the 2,000 codes that shows, believe it or not, a decrease. But again, that's basically budgetary adjustments. We haven't contemplated cuts to programs just yet. But not cuts to programs or cuts to staff or increasing staff. We're going to be looking at our staffing analysis for our next budget presentation. So again, these are projected expenditures, and again, these are tools. They're not actual, they don't represent actual expenses, but it basically represents the maximum you can spend in those specific categories. And the idea is not to spend the maximum, but try to get other funding sources and be as efficient as possible during the course of the school year to generate some fund balance. Most of the increases in the 1,000 or in the 5,000s, the 9,000s really reflect, as I said before, just rising costs and inflation. The 9,000 code also includes that interfund transfer line, which shows that increase. And finally, the last point I wanted to make is that there are still 6 weeks left to the budget process. And so these preceding figures are based on reasonable requests made by our budget managers, which is our administrators and our team, who basically make these requests. And as we go through the budget process, we look at staffing, we look at our revenue, and we finalize what our revenue is, we'll make final determinations in terms of what our expenditure will be moving forward. And that pretty much concludes my presentation. Again, our next presentation will be on staffing. We'll talk about buildings and staffing, specifically in terms of full-time equivalents or FTEs, which will be followed by our budget vote on May 16th. So at this point, I'm going to go defer to President Felice for questions. We'll start with Trustee Barry.
Start on this side.
And at this point, you can start streaming the full screen.
I just wanted to ask in particular about the equipment that you were talking about adding to the budget, whether it be playground or things like that. Why are those not considered capital expenses?
I have a better answer. So I think capital expenses has to do with correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gay, with facilities and buildings, not equipment. So equipment, like, in other words, a playground is considered equipment, not like a, you get what I'm saying?
I guess I
it's
do.
been a long time.
That was my question. I Googled it trying to find an answer while you're
Yeah,
doing the presentation.
so like a scoreboard wouldn't be considered like a capital improvement or improvement to the facility. Again, it's a piece of equipment that we use to, designate the score and stuff. That's the way I understand it. I don't know if there's a better way of explaining it, but
That's pretty much it.
yeah. So like playgrounds are considered school equipment.
Trustee Kavanaugh, any questions?
I do not have any questions.
Trustee Flippin? Trustee Trent?
Mr. Santana, can you flip to page 14 for me, please? I have a question about overages. It's so hard to not ask the question while you're in mid-presentation.
Sorry.
And I always forget it. But do you see a budget line, the last codes are 141,
Yep.
overages? What is that line for?
I'm gonna ask,
Defer to me.
I'm gonna defer to you, because I think you can explain it better than I can.
So what happens is every year,
I can explain it. Let me try.
Oh.
all right,
I'm not cutting you off. Overages,
Oh, that's fine.
as a high school principal. So basically, overages, correct me if I'm wrong, in high school, teachers teach 5 periods. They're considered a 1.0 FTE. Each class you teach is a 0.2. So 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2 is 1.0. And overages when you have one extra class or 0.2. So there's 2 ways of handling an overage. You can hire a part-timer, which will be a 0.2 employee, and sometimes you do that. You work 0.2 as an employee, and your 0.8 substitute teacher, for example. So overages represent the amount of money is allocated to the different teachers who may have overages in their schedules, which is a prorated amount added to their contractual salary.
perfect.
So that number seems large to me. Would it not make, is it cheaper this way than rather than hiring a staff and giving them those 5?
That's a great
Those 5
question, actually.
assignments?
And so the idea always, if you could get part-timers, it's always better to get part-timers. And whether or not it's hard to answer the question because it all depends on the overage itself. In my former district, for example, the overage was a prorated based on the teacher's salary. So if you're like a veteran teacher, the cost for you to do an overage to the district was larger than if you're a new teacher. And sometimes overages are dictated by the master schedule. So the class falls period 3 because it captures the most kids period 3. Sometimes that overage has to go to the teacher who's more senior. But considering we have most overages at the high school in terms of teacher overages.
Okay, so now what caused the decrease here?
So you look at like year-to-year actuals and actual spending and how much we spent this year, so we make projections that we're not gonna need that amount in the upcoming school year. And again, one of the things we're trying to tip away with is having overages. For me, as a building principal in my former life, I'd rather have part-timers, because again, when you look at a teacher's schedule, they need the prep time, they need the times to plan, so I'd rather have that.
But part-timers, from my understanding, are also harder to find,
And that's why you end up.
and they're harder to keep. So you would have another issue that you were dealing with trying to,
So I understand your concern, but I'd rather have part-timers, because then it gives you the flexibility, because another thing that's hard to find are substitute teachers. So usually, like, that's a draw for a staff member, even though if you're somebody out of college or someone who hasn't been able to find a probationary position, yeah, I'm gonna take a .4 assignment in a school district because it gets my foot in the door, I'm doing actual teaching, I'm getting actual evaluations that can help propel my career. And then I'll do the .6, the rest of it as a substitute. But yeah, no, you're right, you bring up some legitimate things because it's always like a slippery slope.
So my next question is on page 15. Sorry, President Felice, I have 4 more questions.
All right, so finish this question, and then we'll go back to Mr. Pacini, and then we'll go
Sure.
back.
So on this page,
I'm sorry, what page are we on, Kevin?
15.
I have it up on the screen. So.
Oh, yeah.
We also decreased the budget line for salary for the cafeteria monitors. So I'm assuming that we're having less monitors?
No, it's a budgetary adjustment. When you look at actuals and what was budgeted, you make adjustments.
Okay. That's,
Okay, trustee Pacini?
So to that point, you're just saying we didn't need that much coverage is what we had in the budget for salary monitors, okay. Forgive me if it was covered, because I stepped down, if it is, and you wanna pass by and tell me offline, that's fine too. But there's projections of decreases in salaries, K to 6, and then 7th and 8th grade at the middle school. And then there's a significant decrease in.
What slide is that?
I'm sorry, 14. Right, the salary K to 6 isn't a lot, so I'm assuming that's through attrition.
Yeah, some retirement, and again, some of it is what we budgeted and actuals.
Okay,
What we're
so
projecting.
I guess my question is, make it easy for you on both budget lines. Is there a staff reduction through attrition, or do we have the same number of staff? And if we don't have the same number of staff, is it due to population?
So we still haven't done our staffing analysis. This is based on our current staff and what we're projecting based on enrollment. So this doesn't necessarily represent any increases or decreases in staff. It's more representative of adjustments.
So this is just year over year. You haven't sprinkled in where you may think you need additional or less.
So that's the next budget presentation, the actual staffing presentation, when you really look at it closely. This is what we're projecting is gonna happen, and over the course of the next 2 weeks. I mean, the process has already been begun.
So basically, these numbers, I mean, like,
All
all due
these numbers
respect,
can change.
these numbers don't really mean much right now.
I don't wanna say in those terms, but they are, as I said multiple times, these numbers will change because, again, we have to look at the actual staffing, we have to look at the course requests from the high school. So they may go up, they may go down. And so when we present our staffing presentations, we'll be more specific.
But so then focus on the second line on the middle school, because it's the biggest drop. Not that it's huge, it's $400,000, but that's a lot of money. What is that, 5 teachers? 4.5? 4 teachers. So is that, so basically that is definitely then, because it's adjustments to retirements, things like that, it is not apples to apples, because this is not the same number of teachers that, correct? So,
Sometimes it's salaries, you gotta remember, so even if someone retires and they're retiring at a salary of 30 years compared to a new
compared to a brand new
employee.
teacher, got it, but that's not here, because you're saying those new numbers aren't here.
This is just based on the
Yeah,
expenses.
Because
associated
my
with
concern,
this
I mean,
past year.
I understand staff analysis is coming, but at this point, to see a decrease, all likelihood next week is showing us an increase. I would think that it would be more prudent to budget, to plug in the same number of people with a plug number that we use for new hires, right? Because you're not, like, again, it is meaningless to me because this isn't good what it's gonna be unless you tell me that we're increasing class size, which I don't think you are. So, okay,
But this is based on how much less we spent this current fiscal year.
no, you're saying that the retirements are netted out of this number, you not?
So you have to look at actuals you would look at actuals for the last couple of years and see how
Okay.
much we've been spending and how much we've been budgeting, if we can make adjustments. The next step is to look at the individual staff members.
Okay, no, and I understand that, but what, so then it goes back to I'll ask the question again. What does this line represent? Does it represent the same number of teachers year over year?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so then you're saying that the staffing number for 22-23 was over budgeted by almost $400,000.
No, that's not entirely correct. What we're projecting in terms, there are some retirements coming out of the middle school, from what I understand, so we're looking at it that way.
But hold on,
And
you just
also,
said-
over budgeting, I don't know if it's the right terminology to use. It's, again.
I know what you're saying, but you just said projection, so, but that, you're telling me this is not projections. This is year over year, and you're saying this is the decreased number, and I apologize if I'm not getting this, but the 23-24 number you're saying is the same number of teachers that we actually needed and actually worked in our district this current school year.
Yeah, it doesn't represent cuts.
It doesn't cut some of people at all, and it does not pull out any retirements going forward.
That's correct, but, and just to say, the 22-23 could be over budgeted, but that was based on the information that they had a year ago.
And I'm not accusing the former administration, I'm just really not, I'm just trying to understand so basically what you're saying is that in this budget line, we budgeted $400,000 more than we needed. And we only know that now because we didn't know that then when we budgeted, because we didn't know what the needs would be. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes?
yes.
Now it makes sense, thank you.
Okay. Would you like to go, because you've been waiting a long time, then we'll go back to the rest of Mr. Trent's questions.
I like slide number 30.
Okay.
I'm just gonna do some ballpark figures here, but I'm looking at the totals there. That the proposed total amount for this year compared to the total amount that was budgeted last year, that's less than 1/5 of 1% of the entire spending plan. And to have that number in the midst of the inflation and cost of living pressures that we've had recently. I just want to be sure that there's enough money in here to run this, to run this district, to continue doing what we're doing.
No, absolutely, we're mindful of that, but I also want to caution that, when you compare total budget to total budget, it's sort of misleading, because when you look at the tax levy in our increase, we're comparing the revenue source from the tax levy to the revenue source of the tax levy, and the component of the budget compared. Those are the two figures you're comparing when we.
No, I'm not comparing the levy at all. I'm not talking about where the money's coming from. I'm looking only at what it's costing
Yeah,
us
so-
to run the district.
Correct, so you have to look at budgets and make sure that, again, you want to create a budget that allows for contingencies, for the unforeseen, but you also don't want to over budget. And that's basically our mindset going in. Do we have enough to cover, when you look at special education, for example, our enrollment can change, or as kids mature and they go through adolescence, they may have an identified learning disability that needs to be addressed, so those things can happen or change during the course of the year. So you have to plan for that.
My point is
But yes,
it enough?
yes,
It's so
Well,
tight compared to what got budgeted last year. I want to make sure there's enough for the next year.
This, I know Cameron's got questions, but it's on the same topic, so if you'll allow me,
It's on-
thank
mine's
you.
on the same topic,
I
too.
just don't, this number, so this is, you're saying is total budget as of right now. Last year versus this year, okay? This is a very dangerous thing to be circulating publicly, because this is a $300,000 increase year over year, or $250,000 increase from one school year to the next, is what's shown here. There's no way on earth you're gonna convince me that this is the way it's gonna look in a couple weeks. Am I wrong? Do you really project, do you think that this 23-24 number's gonna be 143 million? Is what we're gonna need to run the district? Because if that's the case with, you know, I still got it, I mean, we have $1 million, we have a new budget line of $1 million that I still don't completely understand where it came from. So, I mean, between inflation, increases, you know, contractual increases in salaries, right? 70% of our budget is people, and everybody gets a raise. We're only up $300,000, so where are the cuts?
Well, the cuts were embedded, so again, if you look at it line by line, there are some lines that have gone up. So
There's what?
there are lines that have been increased substantially, like some of the equipment lines, some of the lines in the 1,000 codes have gone up. But we've been looking at line by line and looking at actuals and making sure that we're budgeting enough to operate, to Trustee Hayes' point, that we can operate the district and not put us in any sort of financial jeopardy moving forward. But we're gonna propose a budget that we think meets the needs of the district, puts us in a good financial position. And again, these are preliminary numbers. When we look at our staffing, and there are proposals that each of the school buildings have that require an increase in staffing, we're looking at that. So that number may change. But preliminarily speaking, based on the information we have now, that's where we're at. But I'm telling you with full confidence that number will change. But in terms of transparency, this is where we're starting at before we look at staff.
And I would just like to remind the board, go back to the external audit, I think it was page 56 or 57, to see what the
Variance was.
what the variances were. And it would tend to serve the argument that you had just made, Trustee Patini, that lines were over budgeted.
Yeah, we want to reduce that variance as well. So again, the idea is not to plan to have an exorbitant amount of fund balance, you know, we spend it efficiently. But there was a substantial variance from last year's budget.
Okay. I'll look at it, I don't know, Cameron's got questions, so it's his turn, but, okay.
No, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around that point. So I guess my next question is on page 17. My question is about the Mac lab. You said that we need a Mac lab, but from my understanding, there is a Mac lab in the high school, in the basement.
Yeah, the computers need to be upgraded.
Okay.
So you know with technology,
Yeah.
it's like 5-6 years.
So are you looking at an additional Mac lab or just updating the one that we have?
Updating what we have.
Mac lab,
The
the Apple computer?
Apple-
So we're looking at updating the current lab. So we're not constructing a new lab, we're updating it with new machines.
Okay.
Any other questions for the superintendent?
Can we put more money in for doing capital work?
Let's see what our staffing shows. So again, the staffing is a big component, so that's gonna affect, you know, the bottom line. So it's, we're gonna, again, we have to revisit all these numbers as we go on through the process. There's still another 6 weeks to go. And staffing is the biggest one, so the next presentation is gonna be
That's
important.
that was my last question, if I can.
Yes, go ahead.
On page 26, there was a big decrease in the psychologist's salary.
So we hired a couple new we had two, I don't remember the exact amount of
Well,
retirements.
for the first one, it was
Yeah.
one new one, but when the retiree, it was like, it cut, but the new person made about half as when the person retired.
Yep,
Okay. And are you looking to hire in the future more psychology?
no, not right now.
No.
But
Okay.
you did say more social workers,
One more social.
one more social.
Any more guidance counselors?
Not immediate. There is a proposal for adding a guidance counselor at the elementary school level to be split, so that's what you're considered during staffing. So when we look at our staffing request, sure, as a building principal, as a head of a department, I'm always wanting more staff. It's whether or not it's a need or a want. And so we're gonna revisit a lot of this stuff in our next presentation. And finally, you know, I started understanding as someone who watched budget presentations in the past, why districts kept revisiting the same budget lines, and now I'm understanding that it is a process, and they continually change. This is capturing where we're at right now, and trying to reduce our variance in our budgeted to actuals, and to run the district as efficiently as possible, and to not burden the taxpayer
But
more than we need to.
From my perspective, those items are in crucial need of increasing when it comes to bodies in the building. when it comes to psychologists, social workers, guidance counselors. Those are crucial, especially with the things that our young people are dealing with today. And I think that we should really consider adding in those lines, bodies in the building.
So we're gonna talk about that in our next presentation. You know, if I could just use my former high school as an example, we have more staff than we had in my former high school. So, you know, we're at a place that is okay in terms of functioning. My argument is you can never have enough social workers. Because especially to your point, you know, because now there's so many students who identify with having mental health concerns. That has totally changed. So that's why, you know, at the legislative level, at the Albany level, superintendents are advocating for more support in that. But we also have to be fiscally responsible too. And if we're going to add staff, you know, again, we want to make sure that we don't overtax the community. We have to be very mindful because more isn't always necessarily better. You know what I'm saying?
No, I see what you're saying. I get your point.
Can I just ask you to clarify what you just said about the reason the psychologist line dropped? Why is it decreased?
We have a brand new employee out of college who's basically making half the salary.
And that person is in place now versus the person who was the higher rate the previous year? Thank you.
I just want one more question, I'm sorry.
We have a lengthy executive session, so I hope you all can stay.
Continuing on this page, the Chromebook replacement program.
Yeah.
In the past, to my knowledge, students or families had to pay for the Chromebook if it was damaged.
Correct. So there's different approaches to it. This is one of the charges that our director of technology will have, is how do you develop a system where you replace it? Because my argument is if you need it for school, you need to have it. And so, and we don't have this, but in other districts, there's insurance that you can offer families that are really low cost, like $25 for the whole year will cover your Chromebook. But our philosophy in my former school is we replaced it. And, you know, we can always ask for, especially if it's something that was malicious or a child broke it on purpose, you ask for restitution. Losing the powers of speech. It's restitution. That other word was a bad word. So yeah, so it all depends on context, but to me, the fact that, you know, we're not replacing Chromebooks is bothersome to me.
No, I agree with that. But on that budget line, I believe there was a number that we have in this current budget,
Yeah.
right?
Well, we're still replacing them because they become
No,
outdated.
but my question is, since we have that money there, how come students are still paying to get their Chromebooks replaced?
Well, it's just like, again, it's restitution. So if you damage it on purpose.
They're not being charged for accidental damage or things like that. Because, you know, because the Chromebook thing bothers me for a couple of different reasons, right? But you're right, there are students who have had 5, 6 Chromebooks, and they destroyed them all. I mean, that's vandalism, right? So they should pay for it. My problem with the Chromebooks was, during the pandemic, every student just got a Chromebook, and all of a sudden, all these parents and families are now responsible for this piece of electronic. You didn't ask me to sign anything that says that I'm okay to pay for it if it's gone. So if something happened to it and somebody tried to charge me, I'd say dare ya, you know. And then, you know, you didn't give me any type of, you know, case or anything to preserve it. You know, you relied on me to go get a backpack that was going to be padded enough to get. So the whole, and I understand the implementation of it was during COVID when things were crazy. But now, if Chromebooks are going to become a part of education, which they have forever, the process for how we're distributing them and having agreements with families on what their role and responsibility is for it really should be cleaned up.
Right. I was actually surprised that we didn't have protocols in place. Because in my former district, we had parents sign agreements, we had meetings where we talked about how we were going to roll it out, and we provided every kid not just with a Chromebook, but with a case for the Chromebook.
If, for example, I don't want my kids' Chromebooks for the summer. Take it back. I don't want to be responsible for it sitting somewhere in a closet and there's a leak and a flood and they can tell me I got to pay for it. Like, no, you can have it. You can have the responsibility. So that has to get cleaned up, in my opinion.
Yeah, all of it has to be cleaned up.
Okay.
Does that conclude the questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We look forward to the next presentation with the CS analysis.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So, District Clerk, do we have any other cards? No. Okay. So that brings us to closing remarks by the board members. Does anybody have any closing remarks? Okay. All right. So we need to take a motion to go into executive session for the purposes of receiving advice of counsel. Need a motion and a second. Motion by trustee Barry, seconded by trustee Flippin. All those in favor, no discussion? All those in favor, raise your hands. We are now in executive session.